Hello and welcome back to the Will I Vike It podcast. Today, my guest is Monica Wilde, or better known to her friends as Mo. Welcome to the show.
Oh, hello. Thanks for having me.
You're very welcome. As I said to you just before, as we were setting up, it's something I've been meaning to do for a while, and your new project's kind of given me the kick to get in contact with you. But we'll come back to that because I thought maybe it'd be maybe a good place to start would be if you maybe explain to people kind of what you do and who you are, for anyone that doesn't know.
Yes, well, gosh. Well, I think of myself first and foremost really as a plant person. So on one hand, yes, I'm a forager, fascinated by wild food. But I also have a master's degree in herbal medicine and work in clinic with a group of others, mainly specializing in Lyme and infection, the sequelae of infectious disease.
All right.
Above
Okay.
all, I just, love everything about plants.
Yeah.
So, yeah, ethnobotanist covers it, author covers it, forager covers it.
Yeah. Yeah. So I guess, I mean, where did your initial fascination with wild foods kind of stem from? Is that something you grew up with?
Yeah, well, my fascination with plants really started as a kid.
Hmm.
Um, and I grew up in Kenya and first, encountered people using herbs amongst the Kikuyu, who were using them. There's a lovely old woman who used it there. But when I think back on it now, it's quite interesting, these conversations around epigenetics now, because
Yeah.
my great grandfather on my mother's side at the turn of the century, 1899, 1900, was a chemist who was writing about plant pharmacology.
Wow.
Although I never knew him, certainly, when it comes to the plants and also his son, my grandfather, who was very interested in conservation and soil conservation and forestry. All of that seems to have come through, even though neither of my parents were ever interested in plants.
So it sort of skipped a little generation in the middle for some reason.
Yeah, it's like maybe,
Yeah.
some people have a talent for music that skips a generation, and maybe I just have a, love of plants that skipped a generation.
Wow. So, yeah, I guess so if your parents didn't have that interest, kind of, I'm kind of trying to envision what your childhood was like because often I hear from people that kind of they'd go out foraging with parents and that kind of thing. So
Well, I was quite
where
wild
did it start for you?
child, really, because I was the eldest of five children, and there
Yeah.
was only 6 years between me and the youngest. I'm the eldest. And when you're the eldest of five children and they're all very close together, basically, as long as you turn up for meals, everybody's too busy to think about where you are. As long as you stay out of trouble and turn up for meals and bedtime,
Yeah.
um, you know, so it was really quite an unsupervised childhood. And it was also back, I mean, I'm 62 this year, so
Mm.
it was also back in a time where people were not so concerned about child safety and things like that. So, I mean, things that would happen, like I remember when we were back in the UK sometimes for on leave, we'd go and stay with my dad's brother in the Cotswolds.
Mm.
My father was originally from the Gloucestershire area. That's where our family roots are. And the my aunt, who was a quite intimidating, small but quite intimidating woman when she got cross, used to get very fed up having eight children in the house because she had three of her own. And they
Yeah.
would literally drive us out into the middle of the Cotswolds, dump us all by the side of the road with an Ordnance Survey map, and say, if you can get to the Swan at Shipton before closing time, you can all have a ginger beer.
Wow.
And so we used to just wander through the countryside. We always managed to make it to the pub in time.
Yeah.
And, inevitably us, the older ones would be sort of carrying the younger ones. There'd be some bickering and some sword fighting along the way. But you're left with, a real sense of independence, a real love of the land when you're free to roam.
Mm.
And I've got a great sense of direction. So,
I bet you do.
so it was a very
Yeah.
different sort of childhood to the childhood that a lot of kids have now.
Yeah.
Um, and I mean, like, when I was about 9, I was sent back to the UK on my own, to go to boarding school, because that's what people did in those days. They thought it was okay to pay to put your kids in care, which
Yeah.
is really what it is. And you're supposed to think of that as a privilege.
Mm.
And I used to just go to get away from everybody. I just used to go and hide in this sort of old badger set in the in the grounds, take a
Yeah.
book, holiday out a bit, take a book and just go and read in this sort of bit of wasteland with this sort of badger set at the bottom, or just look out and listen to the birds and things like that, and not come out until the shouting got really sort of
Oh,
desperate. So yeah, I was a bit yeah, I just like being outdoors.
yeah. So then how did you get to kind of pick up your knowledge on what all the plants were?
Well, some of it was just from other women around me, like, the same aunt who's in the Cotswolds. She was into dyeing plants, for instance, and we'd go out and find things for her. If you sprained your ankle, she'd bash up a comfrey leaf and,
Mm.
bandage it around your ankle. And then some other friends of mine had a grandmother who lived fairly close to the school I was at, and she'd take pity on me and come and take me out for walks. And we'd go through the countryside. She was French, and she'd sort of go and meadow sweet is for this and comfy is for that. And, um, I just sort of kept just acquiring bits of knowledge. But I think it wasn't, and I loved camping and, doing an underground potato bake. This was sort of thing
Yeah.
that as kids we enjoyed doing. But I think I got into it sort of quite seriously in my late teens, when I had a brush with a doctor and swore never to go to a doctor again. Um, and started to sort of educate myself. But it wasn't until much
Yeah.
later that I found out that you could actually be a herbalist. And the foraging side of it really came because I was bringing up 3 kids on my own back in the early 1990s, and I didn't get any support from their dad at all, no financial support at all. So I was always doing 2 jobs or 3 jobs for money.
Mm.
And a friend of mine, Joanna, was doing a project with the Forestry Commission, with their different ethnic groups, to encourage them to access the British countryside, because in a lot of places, people coming from other countries, particularly more recently with Syrian refugees and things, don't realise that anybody can go out and access the woods, particularly in Scotland, where we've got the right to roam. And so they
Yeah.
were running these programs, and she was doing something with the children, and she said to me, Mo, they need something to do. They need something to do with the adults, and you know about plants. And so I devised this sort of 4 seasons foraging course. I mean, this is about 18 years ago, if not more. And you know, it went down very well. But other people started saying, "That sounds really interesting. Can we do it?" And then the next thing was that social media came along, which meant you could actually advertise and reach people. And I've been teaching ever since.
Yeah.
But it was scary to start with, because I knew a certain amount, but when people started to come back for more than one course, it was like, I can't just tell them the same things again. I've got to up my game a bit. So I
Yeah.
was, in the early days, I was learning as, alongside everybody else. I also realized quite a long time ago that it's not my job that they go away after a few hours being able to absolutely identify everything. What's important for me is that they go away ignited with a passion to
Mm.
learn and discover more. Coming away going like, oh my God, look at this world around us. Isn't it incredible?
Yeah.
And want to learn more.
I mean, I'm amazed that people don't forage more. Like even the simple things like blackberries, you can be foraging them, and people look at you like you're mad sometimes. And yet they're paying what, £2 plus for a tiny little punnet in the supermarkets. Just baffles me.
Yeah, and the funniest thing is in the spring sometimes when I'm out foraging for things like wild garlic,
Mm.
and somebody will come along and their kids will be running along holding bunches of daffodils that they've picked, and they'll say to me like, "Oh, you should be careful. Some of those plants can be poisonous." And I look at the daffodils in the kids' hands and think, "Yep."
Yeah. Do you know, that reminds me actually? So I posted up a really silly video of my daughter, probably might have been last year or the year before, picking wild garlic, where I was just putting in the camera and I was going, there's garlic like all around us. It was really obvious what it was. And I'd go, my daughter's called Ocean, and I'm going, Ocean, I can't find the wild garlic. Where is it? And she's going, it's there. It's right there. But we got criticism on that for saying that I shouldn't be allowing a child to forage stuff in case they pick the wrong thing.
But children are so good. Children,
Yeah.
I mean, children are looking at things really carefully all of the time. And I've seen 2-year-olds catalogue a lawn. And they, as long as you explain it to them, they're really, really good. Better than many
Mm.
adults. I mean, they're at the stage where they're learning that, the difference between a lettuce and a cabbage, for instance.
Yeah.
I mean, when people say it's hard to forage, it all looks the same, I'll go like, well, if you can tell the difference between a lettuce and a cabbage, you've got the mental power.
I,
And they
I
do
guess it's
look at you.
wanting
I
to
mean,
as
I
well.
I remember taking. I've got a little friend who's now 4, who I've been involved with since her birth. I was present when she was born. She was very
Yeah.
precious to me, and I remember when she was only about 14 months, just toddling, and I'd take her for walks in her pram, and I'd pick things and say to her, "Now this one you can eat it," and I'd put it in my mouth and eat it, and then I'd give it to her, and then she'd have a little taste. But even now, if she picks something, she looks at me to see if I nod or shake my head.
Mm.
Um,
I mean, they're sponges, aren't they, at that age? They just
Absolute sponges. And,
take it all in.
there's an old saying that says if you give a child a love of nature before they're 10, they'll have it for life. And I certainly think
Mm.
that's so true amongst the foraging community. So many people fell in love with nature before the age of 10. During your teens, you may, go off. I think everybody needs to spend a little bit of time in the city experiencing that. But as
Mm.
soon as I got into my 20s and settled down a bit, it was back, with that longing for the green, a longing to be amongst the plants again.
Yeah. So I'm going to jump forwards a little bit in your timeline just to make sure I can get through all the stuff I wanted to talk to you about. So you got to a point where you spent a year eating a wild diet.
Mm.
Um, so I guess a good place is probably like, where did that idea come from initially to do that? Or like, what made you want to live on a wild diet for a year?
Well, when you teach foraging, people always say, well, this is all very well, but could you actually live on this stuff? Like,
Yeah.
could you live on this stuff for a year? And
Mm.
I didn't know the answer to that. I knew that in the past we had, quite a lot has changed since the past, but I didn't fully know the answer. And I've always been one of those people that don't take things at face value. I have to know stuff for myself.
Yeah.
So I I think we got to lockdown, and all my teaching fell away, so I didn't have so much work, and I just thought, if I'm going to do it, now's the time.
Mm.
And I decided to do it the following year. And I think for me, it wasn't just about the diet. There was a certain amount of sort of personal politics in there as well, because I've been getting so fed up with this sort of rampant consumerism and the trashing of the earth, this terrible disrespect that we have for our home.
Yeah.
and plastics and waste and overconsumption and the poverty that we leave other people in other cultures in. And so I plan to do it in 2021 and stock up more during the winter. I mean, I do always have a larder full of odd jars and bags of things all the time anyway. I'm like a squirrel. But I was sort of getting towards Black Friday in November, and this
Yeah.
onslaught of buy this and half price and this and that and the other. And I just thought, sod it. If I'm going to start, this is my. It was like not quite a hunger strike, but it was like Black Friday seemed to be like the high mass day of consumerism, and I was going
Yeah.
down a different track. Just seemed to be a good day to start. And as I'm quite impetuous, I think things through, but then I make a decision, and once I made the decision, I like to go.
You go for it. Yeah.
So that's what happened really. And then I decided that I would test my own gut microbiome.
Yeah.
And then of my friend Matthew, who decided then to join me and came up here from Norfolk and stayed up and did the same year. So we were testing gut microbiomes, and that helped to sort of keep me on track, because if I cheated, my gut microbes would be all messed up, and that would be a complete waste of however much they are. I think they're about £190 or something. And then the other thing that I did was I started posting my food on Instagram every day, so people knew what I was doing. So then there was this like imagined peer pressure that if I fell off the wagon, if I didn't do the year,
Yeah.
it was going to be sort of like major face loss of face. Because it's funny, because I'm not always very self-disciplined. I can be quite disciplined about other things. I've had to be very disciplined running this project. But when it comes to myself, I can be, quite ill-disciplined. So I set these controls to make me behave, really. And that kept me on track for the year.
So I was going to ask you whether there was a specific question that you wanted to answer, but you was it just that, could you do it for a year?
Yeah, first of all, it
Yeah.
was like, could I do it? And what would it feel like? And also because one thing I've learned in life is that even when you have a lot of knowledge, it doesn't necessarily translate into real deep knowing or wisdom. There's an old saying by Lao Tzu: to gain knowledge, add a little every day, but to gain wisdom, subtract. And I had lots of knowledge about diet and food, and also because of my training as an interest as a herbalist.
Yeah.
And we've been reading a lot about paleo diets and things like that, but a lot of it just felt wrong because of what I knew on the land around me to be food. And why would have people several thousand years ago with the same brains as ours be satisfied for eating far less, or a restrictive diet, or surely they would have been as experimental and creative, or these other things. And I do find that when a lived experience creates so much more in-depth understanding of things, or things you might not even have thought about before, than just knowing something that you've learned from books and other people.
Yeah.
And then at the end of it, I found the results really interesting, because my gut bacteria was moving around from test to test, sometimes in huge leaps and troughs. And some of it I thought I could relate to the foods that I was eating. And I tried to get some input. I would approach various scientists studying the gut microbiome, offering to pay somebody to have a look and write a report. Just a little opinion for me on what they thought was going on. But of course, then I immediately met the issue of, well, for a start, a lot of people not ever replying. I can understand that, everybody's busy, and this was a bit niche, this like slightly weird woman in Scotland who decided to, live off God knows what. But also, what became very clear from the people who did respond to me was that, well, one or two people does not make interesting science, because you could just be a
Mm.
weird aberration. What does it tell you? It tells you nothing. It
Yeah.
might say, well, this might be interesting to develop. So what we needed was a proper study. And that was where the whole idea of the Wild Biome Project was born. And, I thought, I was sort of mulling it over for basically most of 2022.
Mm.
And then um, got the opportunity through Dan Saladino for an introduction to Tim Spector, who was running the Zoe Health Project, and
Yeah.
he agreed to sponsor the gut tests, because of course this is all quite expensive. Doing science is expensive.
Yeah.
And so I went back to the Association of Foragers, which is an organization that created a community amongst people teaching foraging, that myself and a few other people had set up about 10 years ago now, and asked some of my foraging buddies around the country if they'd be interested in participating. And so managed to persuade 23 other people to do this. 12 did it for a month and 12 did it for 3 months.
Yeah.
And in addition to the gut microbiome, ran sort of, blood tests, because you can do these home prick tests and things.
Mm.
I'd learned in my master's degree, I'd learned to design clinical trials. So, I did this very, ethically and
Yeah.
carefully. And again, very interesting results. But there's so many more things, or more other, every study you do raises more questions. And so I thought, well, run it again in 2025. And wouldn't it be great to have double the number, 50 people?
Mm.
And it ended up that after the first one, we ended up with an interested list of over 200 people.
Wow.
And 125 people signed up initially, went through, the sort of induction phase, and then signed a formal, signed consent form. And
Yeah.
we've got about, there's always some dropping off between signing up and actually getting started. But we've ended up with about 100 people now living on wild food for 1 month or 3 months.
Wow.
Again.
Yeah.
And it's going to keep going.
And it's actually so recently, kind of my Instagram feed has kind of taken over a little bit with this stuff, because I've kind of been introduced to so many people that are involved, and even just like the range of knowledge and the kind of the creations, the food that these people are making is incredible.
Yeah, yeah. Well, behind the scenes, we've got, because to manage this, it's I'm managing it single-handedly, and my daughter's helping with the app side of it. So behind the scenes, which is the non-glamorous, the not beautiful Instagram side of it.
Yeah.
Behind the scenes, what I
Yeah.
did was I used a community networking computer app to set up a support forum. So everybody who's on the project has access to that. And within that,
Yeah.
I did things like, set up a clear place for project information, and also regional groups, and divided and asked, people that I knew in each region, would you be a regional point of contact, so that people would get to know each other and meet up and go out together within their own regions. And one
Mm.
of the lovely things on the last drop-in meeting, because I've been holding regular drop-in meetings in the evenings to provide support, is that people have said that, one thing they didn't expect on this, but have found, is this wonderful sense of community and support. Because I don't want people to fail. This isn't a Bear Grylls type survive in the wild thing. This is a genuine interested experiment in what happens to our
Mm.
bodies when we eat wild food. So I want everyone to succeed. So
Yeah.
of put in this sort of framework for support. And then in order to track what they're eating, when we did it in 2023, at the end of it, I had food records that were, some were in Excel, some were typed up, some were, pages out of a notebook, some were pictures of people's Instagram feeds, some
Yeah.
on the back of beer mats. So it was
Yeah.
quite difficult to pull together the data in such a way that we could really crunch it against the results. And everybody
Mm.
kept saying, oh, it would have been so much easier if we had an app. So over the last year, my daughter's been working with me, Caitlin, and we developed this app called the Eat Wild app, where I've put all my recipes into and lots of foraging tips and seasonal knowledge and everything, primarily to support all the people doing the Wild Biome Project. And what they
Mm.
can do is make a recipe every day and just list all the ingredients of everything that they're eating. And I have opened it up to the general public as well, because that will help to financially support this, because at the moment there's no
Yeah.
grant, but we'll come on to
Yeah.
that later. But this gives us an incredible resource, because what we're actually able to do is to track the calorific and macronutrient and micronutrient of what they're actually eating. I've put all of the data I've been collecting for the past 18 years on wild foods and wild food nutrition, which is a passion of mine,
Yeah.
into this single database, which doesn't exist anywhere else in the world, because I would have found it. And at the end of it, we not only can we ask it, we can extract data and look at, the impact on people's health, like, is there any commonality in people whose, cholesterol came down, or in people whose cholesterol didn't come down, or if somebody's blood sugar went up, not down, we're seeing it always come down.
Right.
Were they eating something different? But it'll also answer other questions like, if everybody suddenly started eating wild food, this is another question that people ask me,
Mm.
what would be the most, the species that would come under pressure? Would it be nettles and dandelion? And how much
Mm.
does one person eat?
Ooh.
So, we can actually look at this from a food security point of view
Yeah.
and also a sustainability point of view. And then maybe those decisions can feed into farming policy in the future. I mean, who knows? Data is, data's fascinating stuff.
Yeah. So kind of tying it into when you first did your wild diet, and
Yeah.
you said you had these your gut biome going up and down and changing. So I know as obviously it's still ongoing, but has the initial kind of results from the first group project and then this one, has that kind of collated with what you found with yourself, or is it completely different?
Yes. Well, with the 2023 cohort, we weren't able to test them every single month, which is
Hmm.
what I'd really wanted in the first place. So we could only see the movement between the beginning and the end,
Okay.
and as an overall aggregate for all of the group, even though some were doing 1 month and some were doing 3 months, there was a movement of 13% change, positive change. In the
Hmm.
control group, there was a movement of hardly 1%. So there was a big change, and in some people it
Hmm.
was far more than others. We saw, people who were overweight lose phenomenal amounts of weight. I mean, it's actually, the wild biome diet is actually more effective than a semi-glutide injection,
Wow.
which all in the news at the moment.
Yeah.
I mean, I've been on it for 3 weeks. 3 weeks yesterday.
Hmm.
Is it Tuesday today? Been on it 3 weeks today,
Yeah.
and I've lost 4.5 kilos. All right. Now, I'm
Hmm.
happy to do that because, I have a genetic condition called lipedema, which means that normally on any diet whatsoever, I don't lose weight. But on this one, I do. So we're seeing really good weight loss across the board. But by the end of it, a lot of people will lose weight initially in the first sort of week or so, but then it sort of evens out. So we didn't
Yeah.
see anybody drop out into the too low bracket last time. And then with that comes improvements in cholesterol. 60% of people with high cholesterol, that came down. The
Mm.
other 40% didn't, and we don't necessarily know why yet. Blood sugar, we see improvements. And what was so fascinating is even this time, where quite a lot of our participants are wearing these continuous blood glucose monitors on the back of their arms.
Mm.
And I have this, you know, an overview of the graphs because they can, you know, they can allocate their monitor to be seen by me. And, you know, you can look at the graphs and you can see the first 7 days, because they're wearing them for 7 days before and then 7 days once they've started the diet. You know, the first 7 days, you see the graph zigzagging up and down as their blood sugar changes throughout the day. And literally, almost from day one, you see that curve start to smooth.
Really?
And there's such
Wow.
a marked contrast just at the beginning of this project now.
Yeah. I find that interesting because it's been a really long time in human history since we've relied on a completely wild diet. We've been farming for thousands of years. So I find it interesting that our bodies are still kind of, I don't know, almost naturally inclined to that diet.
Um, yeah, it's an interesting one, isn't it? Because even
Mm.
when people started farming, you know, initially they were just farming calories. You know, they were farming to get through the winter
Yeah.
and still eating wild foods. And certainly, you know, when you look at famines and things like that, you know, a lot of wild foods were called famine foods because that's what people went back to and ate. And,
Yeah.
you know, right up until the First World War, you know, you still had, you know, recipes for wilted dandelion greens and dandelion,
Mm.
buttered dandelion, you know, in cookery books and things. And, you know, what we tend to know about the history of food, a lot of it is documented, you know, in cookery books from about the Elizabethan era onwards, so post Viking. Um, and the cookery books were written by people who knew how to write. So normally they were people in the sort of, you know, nobility or upper classes or whatever
Yeah.
we like to call it. And for them, you know, imported ingredients would have a certain cachet. But, you know, I mean, it wasn't really until around the time of William Orange, for instance, that a lot of fruit trees started to be grown and fruit started to be grown in this country. And before that, people would have been entirely dependent on wild strawberries and wild raspberries and, you know, nasty little feral crab apples and things like that.
Mm.
So it
Yeah.
wasn't as if with farming we suddenly adopted a UPF diet.
Mm.
There was
Yeah.
a gradual transition, but yes, you know, we did have the winter calories, and that was really necessary, I think, in certainly in Northern Europe because of the lack of roots. I mean, you know, one of the things when people are discussing gut microbiome is they compare us to the Hadza. You know, oh, we don't have as many gut microbes as the Hadza in Tanzania anymore, and things like that.
Yeah.
You know, it's a very valid point. But as somebody who grew up in East Africa and who's, you know, Africa is a big part of my soul, and I
Mm.
spent time. I mean, like last year, I lived in the Kalahari for 5 weeks with a group of Bushmen um, who are still, you know, trying to live as much in the ancestral ways as they can. There's a huge difference between the two hemispheres. You know, in the
Mm.
southern hemisphere, you know, in the lands of the Hadsane and the Jutwansi, you have very little greenery. You know, it's very hot, it's quite desertified, you know, and, you know, eagle eyed women will spot this tiny little tendril of green winding round the bottom of a rather scrubby thorn bush and, you know, leap to it with alacrity and dig out a tuber the size of a baby, you know. So they're eating a lot of this sort of really fibrous carbohydrate in their diet.
Yeah.
But, you know, tubers are there to store water and sugar during the dry season. Now, in Scotland, and I would say probably most of the UK, there's absolutely no need for plants to store water. So if you look at our native roots, dandelion, it's pretty skinny.
Yeah.
Big nuts, legend has it that you can find them as big as a golf ball, but I've never managed anything bigger than a large chestnut or small, a large hazelnut or small chestnut. And it takes quite a long time to dig them up and find them. Burdock is
Mm.
probably, the thickest root at about, 1 inch, 2.86 centimeters to metric as well. So our ancestors, when they came here, they didn't have a lot of roots to fall back on,
Mm.
which means that you're either hunter-gatherers, but if the animals aren't there, what do you fall back on in the winter? So farming of the carbohydrates that we need to fuel our bodies during the winter, or in the absence of being able to go into ketosis and eat, wild animals, was pretty much imperative to developing any sort of civilization in the north.
Mm.
But people would still have eaten everything else as well, because storage facilities would have been limited. Early attempts at farming weren't with great big tractors producing acre upon acre of einkorn wheat. They would have been small affairs where people would have grown enough for their families, and that would have been a very tenuous amount when you think about it.
Yeah. So how does I'm assuming that you picked this time of year for a reason to start the project, as they're only
Yeah.
going for a few months.
Yes, because this time I'd hoped, and we've just managed with most of the 3-monthers to implement some testing on day 30 and 60. So I'm fascinated about not just does this change your microbiome, but what's happening during the year as you eat. And this is to do with my understanding of seasonality. And so if you start in April, you're coming from a winter diet.
Yeah.
And you're moving rapidly into a spring diet. But by the end of June, you've clearly moved into a summer diet as well. So we've got this variety. The wild garlic that's here now won't be available in June. And in June, there'll be wild strawberries and, plants on the Merce that are not available now. So what it does is it says, okay, you're going to have some variety as the season moves, and what happens to your gut as that movement happens. So that was
So are they
behind it.
so are they allowed to how much kind of preparation are they allowed to do? Do you limit how much they can pack their freezers full of wild game and that kind of thing? Or
No, I mean, you have to accept that this is going to be, that we're doing this with freezers and cars and jam jars. My goodness,
yeah.
jam jars. There's an incredible invention.
Yeah.
You can pressure can something, pressure can some stew into a jam jar and travel with it. It's
I
and
wondered if someone had enough time to prep, they could literally prep all their meals for 3 months in advance if they wanted to then.
well, they could, but that would be kind of defeating the purpose of this, wouldn't it?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
to a certain extent, I mean, I've had to allow, in order to get the full complement of people doing this, and to take into account that people still have jobs. You can't
Yeah.
give up your life for a month or 3 months. So you've still got to work around having a job. And some people want to do this who are living in cities where it's not easy to access spaces. There's had to be some allowances to stop them starving. you For
Yeah.
instance, in the past we would have collected wild birds' eggs. Now, I don't want people collecting wild birds' eggs. It's illegal. It's unethical. The birds actually need all the support they can. So
Yeah.
we've developed an egg chart whereby if you spot a wild bird's nest, you can look up the bird in the egg chart and see how many eggs it lays on average in its nest. And then you can have the equivalent in organic chicken's eggs or
Okay.
quail or duck. And
Yeah.
But most of the people doing this are doing this because they're genuinely interested in foraging. I mean, it's not easy doing this, as glamorous as some
Mm.
of it looks on Instagram with some of the beautiful creations.
Oh
It's
yeah.
tough. It's a very different way, and we're not living in
Mm.
communities anymore. We're not going and gathering together and cooking together, and most of us are doing this in isolation.
Yeah.
But I don't think there's any one single person who is trying to just live off their frozen supplies. But yes, it does make the seasons a little bit different.
Mm.
But I have said to people, look, if something is, if you have needed to buy some acorn flour because last year was really bad for acorns. If you've had to buy it, buy a little to compensate for the fact that all your acorns have gone moldy or something,
Yeah.
be very mindful of the fact that you don't just go and sort of think, oh, well, that's allowed, and buy it and then eat it in the same way that you'd eat supermarket stuff, just day in and day out because you can buy it. That's
Mm.
really not the point. The point is to push ourselves as much as we can to stay authentic to the season as much as we can. But yeah, there has to be a certain amount of trust and saying to people like, you're adults, you signed up because you really, really want to do this, so go live it.
Mm. I'm imagining I mean, probably an understatement, but it's got to be really tough. I mean, I don't think I could do it.
Well, people say that, but
Mm.
it's and I think it's what's been interesting this time is that some of the people who did it in 2023 are doing it in 2025 again, because they felt great on it last time.
Yeah.
It's not just the sort of health aspects, weight loss and improved cholesterol, blood sugar, and things like that, but you feel great. You feel clearer and sharper. Inflammation goes down, but also spiritually, your sense of connectedness to nature and the land takes on a whole different perspective.
Mm.
There's nothing more incredible than wondering what on earth you're going to eat and going for a walk and just being gifted. Um, it's the most yeah, it's the most benevolent and beautiful sort of experience, and you do have this renewed sense of gratitude and care. Um, one of the people on the call the other day, she was saying that she said it's crazy. She said, I teach nature connectedness and I teach foraging, and this has made me feel truly more connected than anything I've ever done. So people coming back to this, I've
Mm.
seen them. They've been through it once before. They know what to expect, and the first couple of days can be a little bit tricky making that transition. But they've sunk into it. They know the tips and tricks. They've sunk into it really easily. Whereas people doing it for the first time, some of them have really quite struggled in the first week, in particular, when you realize, oh, hang on, I've got to be quite organized and focused about this. But then
Mm.
but everybody's been really great at supporting each other in the community behind the scenes. Um, and
Yeah.
things that people think, what most people say, oh, I couldn't do it. I'd really miss coffee, or I'd really miss butter, or I'd really miss, chocolate. But once you're in the zone, you really don't miss it a lot. I mean, I don't know.
Yeah. I think for me, it's not so much whether I'd miss stuff; it's whether I could gather enough without just raiding my freezer, which is full of venison, which would be too tempting to do if I was, hungry one day and be like, well, I do have venison in the freezer.
Yeah,
I
but
think
then
that's
you
where I'd
would,
struggle.
hunt, you see,
Mm.
and fish,
Mm.
because the foraging, nowadays has more come to mean plants, but traditionally it meant, the foraging of all food resources.
Yeah.
And you also wouldn't have just picked and, just picked bits, like just lived on venison steaks or fish fillets. You would have made use of the whole part of it. You would have cooked up the fish heads.
Yeah.
Um, one of our participants in the Netherlands, because we've got participants from 12 different countries,
Wow.
um, she actually won the Dutch version of Alone, which is a television program where they take you off into the wild, dump you by a lake with some primitive tools and leave you there.
Yes.
And
I've had a contestant on the show before, actually.
yeah, well,
Um,
Dan won it. And she said that her trick was, eating the fish heads and saving,
yeah.
she'd dry and keep the fillets. I think she's still living off the fillets. But every time she fished, she would, eat the head and the fins because that is more nutritionally dense and complex.
Yeah.
And also, when if you do take the life of another living thing, and I include plants and fungi as living too, but unfortunately, we have to accept that that life is a cycle of life, and at the end of the day, there's always death involved.
Mm.
So if you do take the life of something else, you should respect it and honor it by using every single part of it, that's precious, and making it last and putting it to good use. This is the complete antithesis of the waste that we see in industrial food. And
Yeah.
in industrial I include the industrial farming of animals and plants and things too. Um, for a while I lived as a vegetarian, and then I became aware of the fact that even when plants are grown, animals are killed to defend those crops,
Yeah. Yeah.
and and tossed aside and wasted. So I don't eat any industrial produced meat at all. Um, so you would have hunted and you would have fished, but that you wouldn't have been able to go to the office every day and do that as well. So
Yeah.
we're having to create this balance, because we're trying to
Mm.
look at nutrition and the what happens to our bodies. And I
Yeah.
personally think it's really important work, because when you look at natural disasters and man-made conflict, foraging, people still go back to foraging. There was a study done in Syria during the conflict in Syria, which showed that foraging, foraging, went up by, I think it was about 82% or something in regions. It's the
Wow.
same after those terrible earthquakes. People go foraging. In
Yeah.
Ukraine, when Russian tanks were surrounding some of the villages, people were going, and laid siege. People were going out and foraging.
Mm.
Um, so we've got climate change, we've got global, you know, political instability. We don't know what the future is for our generation, the next generation. And to keep the knowledge of hunting and gathering alive, and particularly, foraging for plants and things, but also to really understand what their nutritional impact is and the nutritional effect on our body I think is really important, which
Yeah.
is why I've done this, because up until now, all of this has been, self-funded by myself and the participants. And running a project with 100 plus people, it's a full-time job. I'm not actually, I've had to take a sabbatical from my other things just to do this. And, and I've put my heart into it, and I wouldn't do that if I didn't really believe that this was
Mm.
an incredibly important thing to do. But from next year, we've got this incredible collaboration with the University of Bradford now. Two people from there's the School of Forensic and Archaeological Sciences and Forensics, went on a walk with Lisa in Leeds and heard about the Wild Biome Project. She's one of the participants, and got in touch. And so now we're developing a 5-year project going forward. And so we'll be doing another one in autumn 2026 to look at that side of the year when it's full of the nuts and the berries and so on, much more carby based diet. And they're also analysing our hair and nails
Wow.
because in the past, they've got they can do isotopes on bones and teeth and things from
Yeah.
our ancestors, but our ancestors didn't keep diet diaries. So some of the time they're just trying to guess or estimate, and plant remains aren't very good at surviving except in bog remains.
Mm.
So they're going to learn a lot about what we ate in the past, and their special, their area of particular interest is in famines as well. So yeah, it's really exciting.
So do you have anybody? There must be a cut-off point that you're obviously monitoring people's health. Obviously, people need to remain safe. So
Yeah.
I'm presuming you've got levels set that if someone, I don't know, lost too much weight, you'd have to say you can't continue with the project.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. And also, because we're testing at the beginning, there were a few people whose when their initial tests came back, it was like you'd be advised not to actually consult a doctor about your test results and not to carry on.
Yeah. Yeah.
And and the results are all kept in absolute anonymity. So everything is given a code. Um, So all their stool samples and the blood tests that they do are given a code, and I'm the
Mm.
only one with the key to the code. So even when even at the university, when they receive the hair and nail samples, they just have a code on them, and I can give them matching pairs of codes, but nobody's name gets revealed. If I go onto
Yeah.
a bus, nobody's going to know who's who's who. But anyway,
So what would you, I guess, hope would be the main outcome? Obviously, you've got this lining up a 5-year version of the project. So what would you kind of hope that, I guess, us as humans, humanity, would gain from the project itself?
well, the next 5 years, with the university would be funded.
Mm.
They've been going through various levels of funding applications and things, which is great, particularly given that it's hard times for universities at the moment.
Yeah.
And that means that you'll have a whole team of people on it. And but by building up this sort of data set and this knowledge, what it means for is that from a general public point of view, um, we'll just understand a lot more about diet and what we might be missing.
Mm.
I mean, it used to be that they said, eat, you 5 a day, 5 a day, you 5 vegetables or whatever. And I think now some people's nutritionists that suggest you should eat 30 different vegetable, 30 different plants a month or something. But I
Yeah.
could tell you from the 2023 that the average is 40 to 50.
Wow.
And I mean, um, in the course of the year that I did it, I think I ate just over 300 species of plants, 87 species of fungi, 20 different species of seaweed. So, we will actually, by tracking it and publishing it, both, to our peers and also in scientific journals, we actually might see a little bit more about what we're missing,
Mm.
because people's attention is really focused now on the whole discussion around UPFs and this national epidemic of obesity, particularly in children,
Yeah.
and how far we've possibly strayed from our, what we've spent. I mean, as you said, we've been farming for thousands of years, but we've been hunter gatherers for 300,000 years
Mm.
and so much longer.
Yeah.
So we'll get more insight ourselves. Um, we may well start to understand more about the relationship between things like diet and um, diabetes, diet and obesity, diet and cardiovascular factors.
Mm.
It's possibly too big a question to look at diet and cancer, but as you start to build data sets and things, then in the future you can go back and interrogate those data sets. I want people to really understand about seasonality, because
Yeah.
when people think about seasonality, they think about oh, is the asparagus grown in Norfolk or flown in from Peru? Or, um, what they don't realize is that whole food groups go in and out of season.
Mm.
Going back to those early farmers, they would have harvested wheat at the end of the summer. It's a grass seed. And that would have been stored until other supplies ran out. And people would have started to eat it probably from about November on. But
Yeah.
they didn't have, the storage facilities that we have now, these great big farms and mechanization. They would have just grown it for their families. They would probably have run out by the end of January, or Pancake Day, which was when they traditionally finished it up. And then
Yeah.
you wouldn't have actually had any more until the end of the summer when the wheat ripened, because it's a grass grain. So seasonality is not just about, is strawberries in season or not right now. It's like, is this food group in season? Is sugar in season right now? Is dairy in season now?
Mm.
These and it's these movements, I think, that um have such an interesting impact on our body as well. And then aside from that, as I said earlier, it could feed into a better, more diversified, soil nourishing farming policy. It,
Mm.
there's, yeah, there's many things that we still need to learn and know.
Yeah. I mean, it's from the historical perspective, it's kind of a thing that often try to get across to people is like how different our diets are, how varied they would have been, how much more seasonal. And I'm sure, I don't know whoever that'll be the main take from your project in the long term, but I'm sure that that makes a huge difference to our health.
Yeah,
Mm.
absolutely.
Yeah. It's just bound to. It just seems almost obvious.
Yeah.
Like we eat the same foods day in, day out. It's not good for us. That's not kind of, don't want to say designed to do, but you know what I mean.
Yeah, it's like the seasonality of wheat. I mean, apart from the fact that wheat nowadays has been bred to be quite different from the lower gluten einkorn and emmer and things like that, but it's a seasonal crop. And if you have wheat, a wheat-based cereal for breakfast every day, and a sandwich for lunch every day, and pasta for supper every day, and you do that for 365 days of the year in and year out, and after 30 years you go to a nutritionist and you say, I think I'm gluten intolerant. No shit. I mean, really?
Yeah.
We're not designed to eat the same thing all of the time. Nature handily takes it out of our reach,
Mm.
and we have to go on a different track, and then she gives it back again.
Yeah. Mm.
And you get this debate about things which people consider to be a little bit toxic as well. For instance, there's a big tradition in many parts of the world of eating comfrey leaves as a ratatouille and as a stewed vegetable. And in places like South Africa and Israel and other places that I've heard of, people grow it as a vegetable. And yet, when you look at the literature, it contains pyrazidine alkaloids, and in large quantities it can harm the liver.
Yeah.
But it's only there for a short period of time before it becomes completely unpalatable. People find ways of processing things. I mean, in China they still eat aconitum, monkshood, but it's treated in a certain way.
Yeah.
But these things go out of season very quickly. So yeah, I'm not suggesting that people go out and eat poisonous plants. Please, caveat on that. Make sure you know 100. Don't put anything in your mouth unless you're 100% sure you know what it is and how
Yeah.
to prepare it.
Yeah, sure. I mean, yeah, comfrey is one like I mean, historically it was a brilliant sort of medicine, wasn't it? But
It
we
still
are
is a
advised not
brilliant
to.
piece.
Yeah, but we're advised now not to use it in that way, aren't we?
Yes, I mean, I personally I personally still took it. I had an operation earlier in the year, and I took it. Um,
Yeah.
but I didn't intend. I wasn't going to take 500 milligrams per kilo of my body weight for 9 months on a trot, um, without expecting to see some repercussion.
Yeah. Comes back to moderation, doesn't it? It's like you say,
Yeah,
it's not always
and
there.
giving things a break
Yeah.
because nature takes it away.
Yeah. So I do have quite a few more questions. I don't know how much time you've got this evening. We didn't sort of cover that at the beginning. Are you all
Well,
right at the moment?
I'm one of those people that if you get me on my favorite subject, I'll still be rattling on at midnight. It's more what your very your very patient listeners have got time to read through.
No, no, it's all good. Because as I mentioned to you, I've got my questions I ask everyone. There's a few kind of we could do some quicker questions before we get to those, if you like, because there's just a
Yeah.
few other things I wouldn't mind kind of hearing from you. Um, and one I think that's very important to mention is that you've got a new book out.
Yes.
So I thought maybe you could kind of give yourself a little plug a little bit and explain to people about the new book.
Oh, well, that's very kind of you. Yeah. Well, I mean, I wanted to write a book ever since I was a child, and got the opportunity while I was living my year. And so that was the first book I wrote, The Wilderness Cure, about the year of eating
Yeah,
wild food and my encounters through that year. And then I think the publishers liked me because they let me write another one. So I've written a new book called Free Food,
hmm.
Wild Plants and how to how to find them and use them. And it's really a um, it's not a identification book. You do need field guides, but it's really a guide to how to approach foraging and highlighting all the species in families that you're going to find useful with different sort of tips and stories about them. So, and I've put lots of references to other books in that. If you're worried about distinguishing your poison hemlock from your wild celery, you know, here's a reference for a book that's going to give you everything you need to know about all the umbellifers in Great Britain. So it's a
Yeah.
signpost you to other things as well. And there's lots of wonderful foraging books about. And initially I thought, gosh, does the world really need another one? Because my bookshelves are groaning. But I realized that if you're interested in photography, you don't just go out and get one book on photography. You get lots of them,
Yeah.
and that each of us have got our unique aspects. So I've put in things that you probably don't find in other people's, like my experiments on eating my lawn and the comparative ease of degraining various grass
Wow.
grains, and my comparative table of sap to sugar ratios for different trees. And um, anyway, but it's just my
Wow.
little gift to the world.
So as it's got lots of references to other books, is it a good kind of starter book, or do you kind of need that background knowledge before you
No,
pick it
it's
up?
it's a good starter book because
Yeah.
um, I don't think there's a single foraging book out there from any of my peers, and there's some excellent ones out there where you don't also really need a field guide as well.
Mm.
Otherwise, you'd end up with a book like a doorstop, and unfortunately, the publishers only allow you 50,000 words. So,
Well, you're gonna have to write more then.
well, I had to, in order to fit, I
Yeah.
had to take the whole of the fungi kingdom out. So that's waiting to go back
Ooh.
in somewhere.
Wow.
But I am, at the moment, I am also writing about the Wild Biome Project because it's, and just wild food and diet and the history of diet and around that as well. So,
Yeah.
that's I think that's just really important things that people need to know. And I really love the more narrative storytelling.
So
And there's
there's a
going to
couple
be
of
a film as well.
a film. Didn't
Yes.
know about that one.
Carlos had during 2023 had followed some of the foragers who were doing the wild biome in 2023, and then managed to crowdfund money to get it professionally edited. And I think as we speak, they're just putting the music and doing the final color balancing. So that'll be going out to people who crowdfunded it first, but then out for release. A
Wow.
film about the wild biome in 2023.
Look forward to that one.
Yeah, so it's all happening.
Yeah. It's really interesting. I didn't know that one. Um, so there's a couple of quick fire questions because there's a couple of things that I get asked all the time, and whenever I have a forager on, I try to bring them up. Um, so the one that I get asked the most is, have you ever made yourself ill from something you foraged?
No, I have. I've never made myself ill because I'm always super careful.
Yeah.
Um, but I will say that when you're eating new species of mushrooms, um, you should always sort of just eat small quantities first because we don't have a lot of digestive enzymes for mushrooms. And if you're not used to them, they can give you a bit of a stomach upset to start with
Mm.
if you pig out on them. And given that, there's a certain amount of trepidation about have I identified it correctly, that can lead to alarm at an early stage.
Yes.
So I've never picked a wrong species and made myself really ill. But with
Mm.
mushrooms, I have sometimes been sort of just pushing the little edge of what I'd call gut tolerance.
So, so the other one that I get asked a lot is, what is a good thing for a beginner to forage?
The things they already know:
Mm.
dandelions, nettles. Most people can identify a jaggy nettle or a
Yeah.
dandelion and just learn how to cook them well. Because, when you take people on a foraging walk, they have a taste of things raw and it'd be like dandelion. Oh, gosh, that's bitter.
Yeah.
But when you wilt them in a steamer and then squeeze them out, just before, like you would spinach, squeeze out the water
Mm.
before you serve them up, it transforms them. That a lot of the bitterness is lost in the water, in the cooking water. Which is why they were such a popular vegetable. I mean, dandelion leaves were to the British what rocket was, to the Italians for up until the First World War.
Mm.
And then with nettles, learn how to make wild garlic and nettle soup, but then maybe make some nettle cakes or nettle fritters or nettle pasta, and just explore that to gain a little confidence, and
Yeah.
then just add one new thing a week, because by the end of 2 years you'll have a repertoire of over 100 species, and just spend that week with you'll get a plant of the week and just spend time reading about it, looking at it, going out and finding it, having a chat with it, sit down, introduce yourself, you know look up lots of different recipes. Don't just try and go out and learn everything straight away because you'll just feel
Yeah.
daunted.
Mm.
And then things that are around you. I mean, the amount of gardeners that would complain about ground elder and try and
Oh,
put
yes.
it out of existence, and yet it provides an alternative to parsley and celery from February, late February on,
Yeah.
and wild garlic. Incidentally, wild garlic is the one that I used to hear the most about people poisoning themselves or their friends, because they'd
Really?
go out and pick wild garlic, they'd successfully identify it, and then they'd be picking big bunches of it while chatting to their friend or seeing what the kids or where the dog had gone. And hand to eye coordination would mean that they might get some daffodils or bluebell leaves in it, and that would
Mm.
make people quite sick. So you just have
Mm.
to always keep even if you're chatting to your friends, keep your eye on your hand.
Yes. I had a near incident probably a couple of years ago now when I sent a friend out to get garlic for me. And it wasn't until I started looking through the bag. If I just kind of chucked it all in, I would have been in trouble because it had he'd done that. He'd just grabbed
Yeah,
handfuls. Oh, this is
yeah,
garlic. I'll just grab all that, chuck it in a bag for Craig. And it had dog mercury
yeah. That
with it.
the most common foraging, the most common rookie foraging mistake is picking wild garlic with other stuff in it.
Mm, yeah, we were picking some last week up in Cumbria, and we were. I mean, I was pointing out to my daughter all the things we could find that weren't garlic. It's a good kind of exercise for her. So you're finding the odd bluebell, and there was a tons of dog mercury in this particular spot, your lords and ladies. But it's good while she's picking stuff to go, what else can you see? Because then
Yeah.
she's being mindful the whole time of she's focused then because oh, there's this thing, there's that thing. Oh, we found some garlic mustard. That was another one.
Mm.
She hadn't seen that before. So, oh, what's this plant? Oh, well, that one's fine. We can eat that, but we're not here for that. So we're gonna focus on the wild garlic.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And when it comes to mushrooms, just go, start with things like chanterelles, which are very difficult to identify, to misidentify. Although there's the false chanterelle, but luckily, I know people have eaten false chanterelles and they've been absolutely fine. But, you do have to be careful. Ironically, some of the plants can kill you quicker than some of the mushrooms, but we tend to be more scared about the mushrooms.
It's funny, isn't it, that?
Yeah. But,
Yeah.
go with what's familiar and just branch out, gently and slowly. And
Yeah.
it was the same with, when you mentioned that about teaching earlier, you can teach 10 things really, really well and ignite somebody's passion. You don't have to be able to, teach them 100 species.
Mm.
Because they're not, that people are only going to really take in, 10 to 15 plants in a morning's walk in any
Yeah.
depth.
Yeah.
The rest of it, what it does is just inspire them to want to know and to go out and put the work in.
Well, and every forager has their area. You have mushroom experts, you have seaweed experts. You just there's nobody that kind of knows they're not an expert in everything, There's people tend to kind of hone in on a species, don't they?
Do you think so?
Mm. From the people I've met, I think so,
Yeah.
yeah.
I mean, I teach all three,
Mm.
and I came later to fungi, but then when I realised that, so I really sort of started getting into fungi about 24 years ago now, and well, I just thought, wow, I've got to know more about this. And at the time, I had met John Wright, from
Yes.
River Cottage fame,
Yes. Yeah.
and persuaded John that he'd like to explore more of Scotland. And I would host these, I would do all the organisation and host these, what we call these magical mushroom forays. But they weren't magic mushrooms, it was just a magical foray.
Sure.
And we would spend 4 days just travelling around different parts of Scotland each year, teaching. And it was really just a ruse so that I would learn from an expert how to identify mushrooms. And,
Yeah.
it was incredible. Unfortunately, COVID stopped those because I think we ran them every single year and covered most of Scotland. But then it's always so much easier to learn from somebody else.
Yeah.
If somebody, had to describe in a book a lettuce and a cabbage, but you'd never seen one before, it would go, well, they're round, they're green, their leaves overlap each other, they've got a sort of central spine down the middle of the leaf and a core in the middle and sort of wavy edges. And one's feels a bit limper than the other. And you'd never seen one before. You'd be going, oh my goodness, how am I ever going to tell the difference? But you
Yeah.
can instantly. And when it's like you're doing with your daughter, when you go out with somebody else and you see something, not only do you immediately put it in perspective, but you understand the habitat that it's growing in. You get to feel it. I can tell the difference between poison hemlock, cow parsley, and sweet Cicely blindfolded because of the way that they feel. They feel so different to each other. So it just it's a very there are some things that it's just very difficult to learn entirely from books or apps.
Mm.
And with apps, of course, you don't remember anything. It'll identify it for you, and a lot of them have got fairly accurate these days, or more accurate than they used to be. You should still double check. But the act of taking something home and scratching your head and looking it up in books and puzzling over it and walking past the kitchen table and looking at it going, I wonder what you are, and learning it,
Mm.
embeds it in your brain in a way that app learning doesn't. And if we do end up in a food security situation, and there's no electricity because the national grid's been taken out or something like that, and you haven't got your app, then you're going to be stuffed, aren't you?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's a bit like as well, like you get the same thing on like a Facebook group where someone will just get something to go, what is this? Like, well, you could look it up yourself. You're relying on other people to tell you if you can eat it or not.
Yeah,
Because
and
what they
you'll
want.
get different. I mean, I remember. I mean, I don't do any so Facebook groups at all
Mm.
anymore because it used to infuriate me. You'd have a picture of some foliota, some scaly cap foliota, and somebody would say, "What is this?" And 100 people would go, "It's honey fungus. It's honey fungus. It's honey fungus." And you go, "No, it's the scale cap foliota, scale cap." And then another 100 people would go, "It's like funny honey fungus, honey fungus." And you just think, ah, I just found it too annoying. So I just like, whoa, you know, not for me.
Yeah. No, it's a wasted activity, I think. I think if I'm unsure of something, I quite like something like Google Lens to give me a starting point because you can kind of go, okay, I have no idea what this is. Let's take a picture, look it up, and then that gives you somewhere to go, hang on, right?
Yeah,
And
I
so
think,
and it'll get it wrong sometimes, but
yeah, you should only ever use it as a starting point.
yeah.
And if you're reading information, always look up the person who wrote the article. Do they actually live, walk the walk and live that life and know what they're talking about? Or were they hired off Fiverr.com to regurgitate some content because, companies know that if they put up a nature forum, they can, you know, get people to buy things in the adverts on the side.
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
mean, I hate to be cynical, but I've seen it happen so much, both, in herbal medicine and with this adoption of, nature communities. There's so much out there that is misleading. And the trouble
Mm.
is this information starts to get embedded. It's like with wood sorrel. You're familiar with wood sorrel, the tiny, tiny little
Yes.
plant with the heart-shaped leaves, and
Yeah.
the tangy flavor comes from oxalates. And yet it's now on Google, it'll tell you, never give wood sorrel to a child under 5 or a pregnant woman, may cause kidney stones, oxalates. And even WebMD has this big warning about wood sorrel. I actually calculated how much wood sorrel you'd need to eat to even start noticing traces of blood in your urine. You'd have to give up your job and do nothing from 9 till 5 every day but collect wood sorrel.
Wow.
But it's become
Yeah.
this sort of big, nobody's talking about spinach. Like, whatever you do, don't go to the supermarket and buy 10 bags of spinach and consume them simultaneously
Yeah.
because it is high in oxalates. But wood sorrel, no, we've vilified wood sorrel.
Yeah. That does, it's funny, isn't it? That does tend to happen more with these foraged goods rather than farmed.
Yeah, because we've
Yeah.
been as a society, we've been brought up to fear the wild.
Yeah. I was always told, red berries were grown in the garden. They're poisonous. Now, as an adult, I know that they weren't because I know what they were. They were elderberries, but it was just a staple. Red berries are poisonous. Don't eat them.
But they must be cooked with elderberries
Yeah.
because otherwise you're going to give everybody the runs and stomach cramps. As a friend of mine found out when he forgot that basic rule and made a smoothie, a raw elderberry smoothie. His wife and daughter have not forgiven him yet.
Well, they're saying that. My wife will tell you that she grew up eating elderberries off the bush.
Yeah, but one or two,
Yeah. It's that.
not a whole bowlful.
Yeah. Sure. So I think because I don't want to take up too much of your time, I've already kept you on the call for an hour and a half,
Oh my
and I'm
goodness.
sure, as you said, we could probably keep going for a lot
Okay, I'll
longer.
try to be concise.
But yeah, so there
On with the
are
question.
6 questions that I ask every guest. I think the first one's going to be fairly easy for you to answer. Is do you think you could survive on a Viking Age diet?
I think I could.
I think most people probably would have guessed that one.
Yeah.
So, and this would relate, I guess, to your year on a wild diet because you've really experienced this, you know. So, is there any food you'd miss if you're on a Viking Age diet?
Well, Vikings had dairy, didn't they?
You did.
Yeah. So I think I'd be pretty good on a Viking Age diet. The things I miss on the wild food diet are very often things like cheese and butter and olive oil. But
Yeah.
even the ancient, even the Vikings, I mean, the ancient Celts certainly had access to olive oil. They used to swap it for
Mm.
butter. you know. So I think the only other thing that I really miss is chilies.
Oh, yes.
Do like a bit of heat and spice. And
Mm.
I mean, there's dittany and horseradish, which give you those lovely sort of hot flavors, but they're not quite chili. So
No.
chilies, I'd like some chilies and ginger.
All right. So, what is the weirdest thing in your kitchen?
Probably at the moment, what's the weirdest thing in my kitchen? Well, there's quite a lot to choose from then. Is some beefsteak mushroom jerky. So that's beefsteak mushroom, Fistulina hepatica, which has just been soaked in some wild spices, ground hogweed seed and some a sort of mushroom. It's a bit like soy sauce, but it's sort of made of salted mushrooms,
Okay.
and a little bit of vinegar with a tiny bit of honey as a marinade, um, and then dehydrated. So it's sort of like it's yeah mushroom jerky, but specifically beefsteak mushroom jerky.
Wow. I'm intrigued.
Is that weird? Doesn't everyone have that?
It's no, I don't know. I don't think everybody does. No. But I'm definitely intrigued. That sounds, yeah, something to try. All right. What's the worst food or drink you've ever eaten?
Um, Sea slug.
Sea slugs. Ooh.
Sea slug. I was in China
Hmm.
and given sea slug, which is apparently a great honor because it's full of hyaluronic acid. And one of the first things I ever learnt to say in Chinese was "Wo wuxi haishun," which means I don't eat sea slugs. It was really horrible. It was like a sort of really crunchy salt jelly that with a sort of vague overtone or something. And I don't like shield bugs either. They're eaten in quite a few different countries, and I don't like the taste
Yeah.
of those.
Aren't they quite bitter? I've not tried them, but
They've got a sort of weird, almost very strong perfumed sort of taste or flavor to them that I don't like.
mm. I love how kind of you've tried so many different like things that I guess a lot of people would class as weird.
Yeah, well, I mean, when we moved, you know, because I think because of growing up abroad, I mean, after Kenya, my father moved down to Malawi, and that was just after my mum and dad separated. They got divorced when I was 14, and ended up living on different continents. And going to stay with my dad, I was being the eldest of five. I was the cook, and so I learned to cook um, um, in an African country where its next door neighbour, which provided the rail link to the sea, was at war. Mozambique. So there were always
Mm.
food shortages as well. But I remember at 14 taking over the role of head cook for my younger brothers and sisters and being given a copy of the Malawi cookbook, and chapter 5 was insects. So, yeah.
I haven't eaten too many insects. I've done, what was it? Grasshoppers, I think.
Mm,
Yeah. Which were better than I expected them to be, I'll say.
mm. I'm quite
Um,
partial to wasp larvae, but I'm not eating any this year because the wasp population seemed to really crash last year.
yeah.
You hardly saw any, which was, obviously, I mean, as much as I don't like getting stung or annoyed by wasps, I mean, that was a
Mm,
tragedy for the wasp community last year. And I've just noticed a few this year back, they're licking the boards of my house to make paper for their nests.
mm,
It'll take them a few hundred years to get through the house, but um, so I'm not going to eat any larvae this year.
yeah. All right. So, what is the most memorable meal you've ever had?
Ooh, gosh, well, that's a hard one because I have had some amazing meals. Um, and there's sort of lots of highlights rushing into my head, and a lot of those are restaurants, I must admit. Um, there's the Gannet in Glasgow who do a tasting menu. They incorporate wild ingredients, which is phenomenal.
Mm,
And a lobster bisque soup served by Paul Wedgwood on the Royal Mile, which made my toes curl. And Rupert Waite's at Buck and Birch, with his smoked venison served on, sharpened birch sticks with a dandelion bud, um,
mm.
amazing what he does at Buck and Birch. And tragically, just recently suffered a fire there as well. So hope
Oh
he
no.
gets back on his feet. So, yeah,
Yeah.
those are the sort of. It's when somebody else cooks for me and blows my socks off.
Nice. All right. So the final question is: when you die, your relatives are preparing your grave goods. What food and drink are you taking to the feast in Valhalla?
Well, I don't think any Viking funeral be um, could go without mead for a start.
Sure.
Infused with meadowsweet, which of course means Mides sweet, because it was a preservative. It would stop the honey over fermenting, but also
Yeah.
acts as an amazing hangover cure. So you're getting your hangover cure while you're having a drink.
Yeah. I make that point all the time to people.
Yeah, so
Yeah.
definitely take mead.
Yeah.
Um, and what's going to last in my grave? I don't know. I a lot of respect for the common apple.
Mm.
That's kept me going. Um, yeah, it's a difficult one because it's like, how long is it going to be before I get to eat them? And I'm already planning on being buried in a sack and having my relatives plant a nut tree over the top of me,
Oh, lovely.
because I love the idea of being recycled into something nutritious, and also for the obvious pun of, like, there lies my mum, she was nuts in the first place. So yeah, maybe I'll
Yeah.
take a sack of nuts with me as well.
Sack of nuts.
I mean, you
Yeah.
can go a long way on some dried apple slices and a sack of nuts. You can survive a long time.
So, is there anything you want to plug, social media or website, or maybe give your books a plug again?
Oh yes, okay. Well, my book's called Free Food by Mo Wilde, and the earlier one's The Wilderness Cure, also by Mo Wilde. And my website is monicawilde.com, and my Instagram is at Monica Wilde. And then we also have at Wild Biome Project and at Eat Wild app for those who are interested in the app as well. And yeah, I don't really want to plug lots of things. I mean, I run courses. I'm doing a wonderful solstice wilderness retreat, but let's just leave it at that.
Okay. I guess in future, when you're looking for more participants, you'll put a call out. So if anyone is interested in taking part in future versions, they'll sort of
Yeah,
follow the socials and that kind of thing.
follow the social, but the best thing, if you
Mm.
really have a burning desire to be included in the autumn 2026 cohort, if you email wild biome, or one word, at circadio, circadio.co.uk, which is the formal name of my consultancy, because we have to be formally registered to run this, and just say, please put me on the list for 2026. Then we're collecting all of those up. We've already got quite a list for 2026 already.
Will it be a bigger number? You didn't mention earlier. Is it going to be the same amount again, or are you looking for more people?
I don't know.
You
We'll
don't know.
see. It's amazing how interested people have been.
Mm.
Um, and and it's really, really humbling. And I tend to sort of get my head down, because from an administrative point of view, this is all encompassing. And even after we get off the phone tonight, I've got to go and type out 40 Royal Mail address labels for the next lot of the next cohort, and organise
Wow.
things. And then, I mean, a lot of the time I'm not even posting on what I'm eating on Instagram and everything. I sort of come out of it and think, oh, hang on, there's a whole big thing happening here.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Fantastic. Well, thank you very much for your time. Really appreciate it. It's been fascinating.
Well, thank you for asking me. Thank you for listening to my witterings, and thank you to everyone who's listening.
And good luck with the rest of the project.
Thank you.
Yeah. All right. Take
Okay.
care.
All right. Bye.
Bye. Bye.